This holiday is honestly one of the more difficult ones to really wrap your head around, but no worries. Soon, you'll understand. As the world gets darker, colder, and we stay in our homes with the food from harvest, fires light the inside of our homes, and the family gathers round to tell stories each night. But one day, the light stays for just a little longer than it did before, and there is cause to celebrate. The sun will be returning, and with it, daylight, warmth, and crops. With the return of the sun, heathens of the past looked to the sky and thanked the gods with gifts given for gifts received. This celebration, which was marked on the winter solstice by the venerable Bede's reckoning of time, was called Yule. But the word Yule has come to mean Christmas in our modern language. Now, is there a story behind this? What even was Yule? Is there any record of its celebration? How might we celebrate Yule as heathens today? Let's explore history a bit and see what answers we can find to these questions. Gotta get the little ball in order there. So, when was Yule? Let's discuss its placement as far as we can understand it from the English monk and scholar, the Venerable Bede, who wrote the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, which is an important source for Anglo-Saxon heathens, and the Reckoning of Time, which is a massive text that contains a couple of pages of information about the Anglo-Saxon system of months, an incredibly valuable resource for any heathen interested in reconstructing ancient holidays. The Reckoning of Time. I've never seen a text so verbose in everything except for the part that I was interested in. So, there are a few nightmares to deal with Bede. Bede, for example, mentions a mysterious blot called Mother's Night, about which very few details are given. But he states that it was practiced on the sacred Christmas night, which is likely Christmas Eve. Unfortunately, due to the comparison with the Julian calendar, which drifted, some of his comparisons aren't very useful when it comes to determining actual dates. Notwithstanding that some of the local applications of the Julian calendar did leap year every 3 years instead of 4, history is terrifying. However, he does mention that the day of Yule is on the solstice, and that the first and last months of the Anglo-Saxon year were also called Yule. So, celestial references are so much more useful. We can determine a specific date. I learned far too much about the horrors of trying to measure the solar year while researching this video. Even the calendar that we have now will drift by a day every 3,030 years. So there's a problem that we'll have to deal with, assuming humanity makes it that far. But also the days are getting longer. Did you know there's a leap second? Time isn't real. Snorri also records the time of Yule in a way that confirms Bede. In the Saga of Hakon the Good, Snorri records that King Hakon, the Christian king of Norway in the mid-900s, moved the date of Yule to Christmas, whereas before it was celebrated on midwinter, the winter solstice, for 3 days. Now, the laws of King Alfred suggest that there were 12 days for Yule, but this is likely due to Christian influence of the 12 days of Christmas, which originate with the length of time between the Christian celebrations of the Nativity on the 25th of December and the Epiphany on the 6th of January. So, it seems that we have two sources discussing the heathen date for Yule as the winter solstice, and according to one of those sources, that celebration would last 3 days. However, in a society such as this, you would expect a certain amount of variation. So, as far as any modern practice of Yule inspired by history, honestly, it can be celebrated with convenience around the solstice for however many days you might choose. There's nothing wrong with 3, 12, or really whatever number you might deem appropriate. So, what happened during Yule? Well, the Venerable Bede, venerable and verbose though he may be, gives no description of the holiday. Snorri, however, gives many details in the Heimskringla through the Saga of Hakon the Good. And he gives these details through an account of the controversies that arose when a Christian king went to celebrate Yule with his heathen population. There was a tug of war, you might say, between the king's established duty and customs to lead the Yule rituals and the celebration, and King Hakon's personal religion as a Christian. Among the descriptions that Snorri gives, and this speaks to the variation of timing, was that Hakon declared that a measure of ale was to be made, and that Yule celebrations would last as long as the ale lasted. So the ale could have lasted 3 days, 7 days, 12 days, or more, really. It depends on how excited the ale makers got in the days leading up to Yule, but it does seem that Yule was seen as a party worthy of much drinking. And in modern times, we would have more recreational options than alcohol, so a modern Yule might have more options, but in the Middle Ages, in the middle of winter, not so much. Snorri goes on to describe the Yule celebrations, which are, as one might say, bloody interesting, saying that the temple would be opened, and heathens would gather in the temple, bringing with them bountiful food to last a great feast. Sacrifice was made to the gods, and the blot, or sacrificial blood of the sacrifice, would be collected in bowls called the blotbolli. Twigs would be used to stir the blood, and the twigs with blood would then be flicked, causing sprinkle of blood on the idols of the temple, the walls to consecrate the temple, and then on the people present in order to deliver the blessing. You might imagine a Christian king becoming, well, increasingly uncomfortable. The meat of the various sacrifices was cooked and served along with the rest of the food, which included horse, suggesting an association with Odin at these celebrations, as horse is closely associated with the Allfather. Now, great fires were lit in the middle of the temple, and kettles were hung over them, containing the various meals for the ongoing feast. Snorri describes further that the sacrificial beaker, which would have contained the celebratory ale or mead, was to be carried around the fire as a process of consecration, and the chieftain would bless the beaker as well as the sacrificial meat. And after this, the sacred toasts would begin. The first would be to Odin, to secure victory in the following year. The next would be to Freyr and Njorthur, for good harvests and for peace. And following that, there would be toasts to the king, and finally, a memorial toast for their ancestors departed. Snorri breaks all of this down in chapter 14 of the Saga of Hakon the Good, if you want to read the record for yourself. It's one of the most detailed descriptions of a ritual in any of the available sources, and it's a fantastic foundation for any Reconstructionist heathen looking for a model for a bloat. But there's a few caveats on this to consider. Norwegian history is a very foggy thing, and Snorri is a post-Christianization Icelander writing about Norwegian historical events that took place about 300 years prior. Now, this is a great record, but this is obviously something to keep in mind. So, what we have described here is mostly a medieval potluck in a temple combined with a ritual. Animal sacrifices would have been normal in this period, considering that animals were often slaughtered for food by these same people. A slaughter for a feast would provide fresh meat to the gods as your guests during ritual. And what's interesting here is actually the description of the slaughter of sacrifices for consumption, whereas other records mention such sacrifices as being left at the altar, burned, consumed, or even no mention of their fate. So this grand description is quite valuable. It seems likely that portions of the meal would be discarded somewhere close by for the gods or the land spirits, in addition to the meat from the sacrifices being part of the feast. This is where we might reference other records of offerings, such as Ibn Fadlan's Land of Darkness, in which he describes dogs eating the offerings as a sign of acceptance from the gods. It's likely that a similar attitude was employed here as well. There's also modern conceptions that offer some insight into what a celebration of Yule may have included in the past, some of which support Snorri's story. A buffet of meals in a modern Yule celebration is often called a Yule board, or the Christmas table, which is meant to be laden with bountiful food. There's also the famous Yule log, which coincides with Snorri's descriptions of a massive fire in the middle of the temple surrounded with dangling pots containing delicious meals. To go on a tangent for a second, while researching this video, I saw it advanced that the Yule log was evidence that Yule was stolen by Christians because it was a log that took 12 days to burn, and that the 12 days of Christmas were originally the 12 days of Yule. This seems to be reverse engineered to me because, firstly, I couldn't find a primary source on this. And secondly, the 12 days between the Nativity and the Epiphany originated in Christianity fairly early on and do not seem connected to Scandinavian history. But thirdly, this seems to me to be a gigantic log, like enormous. Like, I understand the Yule log is this huge log at the center of the fire, but 12 days? I feel like I've seen a lot of wood eaten by a bonfire pretty quickly. That would be a log provided by Ymir himself. It would necessitate that the Vikings have a complex trading route going all the way to California, such that they might import sequoias. And this probably wasn't an Icelandic thing, as wood was incredibly valuable in Iceland. So it's doubtful that setting such a large amount of wood on fire would be seen as anything other than wasteful, even offensive. They say if you get lost in an Icelandic forest, just stand up. Another theory around this 12-day Yule log thing was that the tree would be brought into the house and would extend out the door, and they would move it as it burned. And this would take 12 days. Now, maybe this was done somewhere, but I do not see it happening in medieval Iceland or Norway, some of the coldest places that had humans at the time. The idea of hanging your door open so that the burning tree trunk could stick out of it in the dead of winter seems to me a risky plan. Not least because you might freeze to death as all the heat you generate goes fluttering out the door, but the likelihood of setting your whole house on fire is quite high. But hey, the 12-day Yule log tradition is mentioned fairly widely, just not in any primary sources I could find, so I'm sure there's a way to do it. I'm just ignorant. So if you're a Yule log expert, please let me know the proper tradition around this in the comments. I am, however, an expert in not making but eating chocolate Yule log cakes, which are delicious. Whatever the case, thank you for indulging me on this little tangent. Let's get back on track. Snorri's description of Hakon the Good at the Yule feast suggests that all of the food consumed during Yule was sacred. Hakon is depicted as exceedingly uncomfortable with consuming anything, particularly the sacrificial horse meat. The king was meant to lead the celebrations, so Hakon's refusal to participate is depicted as a massive point of contention. The farmers offer Hakon the horse meat. He refuses. So they offer him the broth as a compromise. Nothing else, just the broth. He refuses that. So they offer him the drippings from the cooked meat. He refuses that as well. Finally, Sigurd, a local heathen jarl of generous reputation and who would provide much of the food and sacrifice for the celebration, offers the compromise of Hakon gaping his mouth over the handle of the kettle where the smoke had settled from the meat. It's a lot of transition there, but let's see if this works. Now, Hakon goes up and goes so far as to place a linen cloth over the kettle handle before he goes so far as gaping his mouth over it. And it is recorded that no one was pleased with this, Hakon or the farmers. But this little story shows how thoroughly it was understood that this food was considered sacred to the festival. Hakon understood it to be sinful to consume even the drippings from the cooked meat. So, how can we apply this to modern practice? Well, sprinkling blood everywhere may be a little unsanitary, and such a practice would require a fresh sacrifice. Horse meat is largely considered taboo today, and the context of people conducting these sacrifices were farmers who depended on their livestock, with experience regarding their slaughter and preparation for a meal. Most people today aren't quite in that situation, but what does make sense is a mighty potluck with ritual and offerings. Yule may also be described as a time of generosity. Sigurd, the holder of the Yule festival in the Saga of Hakon the Good, is described as an open-handed man, meaning that he would readily give gifts and share his wealth, and that he would defray the outlays of the temple, suggesting that he was the one who funded the feasts and provided the sacrifices. These acts are praised by Snorri, who said that this generosity is what gave him such a great reputation. Hashtag Jarl Sigurd for Santa 2021, who's with me. So, As Reconstructionists, we're often digging through the past and pilfering little bits here and there from dusty old records to inspire our modern traditions. And there's a million ways for modern heathens to conduct a Yule festival as inspired by this passage. You might hold a gathering of friends with a potluck and a great fire, and you might hold a ritual where a portion of the food is tossed into the fire, or perhaps left near the forest for the land spirits. Let's say you're an independent practitioner. You might have a little campfire outside with a small meal and offer a straw Yule goat to the fire as a votive offering to the various gods of Yule. Such a celebration would be entirely appropriate, spending some silent time with the longest night by the warmth of the fire, welcoming soul back into the sky. Someone in the city might light a candle at their altar and burn some incense, or perhaps they'll hold a Yule party with offerings to be disposed of the following day, or pour libation offerings for the gods. If you want more information on that, on like what offerings are, how they work, etc., you can see my video on offerings for a more detailed discussion on that topic. But you can see how we can take these records and adapt them into our modern practice. We don't have to go look at the medieval source and then copy it directly in our modern practice. There's room enough for adaptation and interpretation. We do not live in that time. We live in our time. Our practice can be tailored to reflect our time period, our location, our living conditions, and our access to community or even desire to be solitary. So, when Hakon the Good moved Yule to the date of Christmas, Snorri records this as part of his strategy to convert Norway to Christianity. And his plan was met with some resistance, and it's an interesting story, but does that mean that Yule was stolen by Christians? Not really. It seems, honestly, that the opposite happened. Hakon's moving of Yule to the date of Christmas has allowed Yule traditions to live on through Christian culture. The name Yule, pagan. The Yule log, pagan. The Yule board, pagan. Christmas ham, likely a reference to Freyr, ostensibly pagan. The Yule goat, very pagan, and likely evidence that Thor is part of Yule in some way. And among Odin's names was Yolnir and Yolfather, placing him as the master of Yule, the one who does Yule, likely influencing Joulupuki, and through him, Santa Claus. Yule wasn't stolen by Christians. In fact, it may be more fair to say that Yule stole Christmas. Yule was moved to the time of Christmas, and it allowed for these various existing folk traditions around the pagan celebration of Yule to become part of that Christian tradition. And today, now that heathenry has returned, we can celebrate Yule during solstice and borrow back many of these traditions that Christianity has kept waiting for us. But let me know your thoughts. What Yule celebrations do you have? Do you plan on holding a Yule ritual this year? Let me know down in the comments. But with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. The subscribe button is currently on fire, and the like button is a pagan symbol stolen by Christians, so let's take it back. The bell is now a Yule bell and should be rung in celebration. And remember to find a way or make one. Yuletide goes in, Yuletide goes out. Never a miscommunication, and you can't explain that.
Tide goes in,
You see, the Yuletide, it comes in and it goes out, Mr. Silverman.